Hello and welcome to Welty at Home. We are the slow reading virtual book club that alternates works by Eudora Welty with works by authors who are connected to Welty in some way. My name is Jessica Russell. I'm with the Eudora Welty House and Garden, and we are currently discussing a selection of works by Welty and other authors that all connect back to civil rights leader Medgar Evers. Today, we are getting to continue our discussion on Turn Me Loose, the unghosting of Medgar Evers, alongside the actual author. So we have a special guest today. Frank X. Walker is with us. Suzanne Mars will be giving his formal introduction. But today we're going to have a Q&A with we'll call him Professor X. We'll get to have a Q&A with Frank X. Walker. He has graciously agreed to join us. We also, of course, are grateful to Suzanne Mars, Eudora Welty's friend and biographer, Professor Emerita of Millsaps College, for being with us today as well. So Suzanne, after I run through some housekeeping, I will turn it over to you to introduce Mr. Walker. Does that sound all right?
Sounds like a plan.
All right. So as you know, and unless you are new, in order to comment or ask a question, we normally click the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and select the raise hand function. It's okay to do that this time, but we're going to switch format. And for most of the meeting, what we're going to try to do is go ahead and call on you. If you submitted a question ahead of time to us to ask Professor X, then we'll go ahead and call on you and you'll get to speak and unmute yourself at that point in time. But if you do have a burning question or a comment and you raise your hand and there's time, I'll definitely be watching for that. So that's all I'm going to say about that, except for, one more thing. Professor X was very kind to send us a special resource that he uses sometimes when talking about the unghosting of Medgar Evers. And I'm just going to place this resource into the chat for you so that you can access it right there. And with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Suzanne Mars so she can introduce our special guest today.
One bit of housekeeping before I do that, we have added a session so that we can have another time, another hour to discuss Turn Me Loose, and that will be next week, October the 9th. So if you will add that session on October the 9th. We're adding October the 16th, aren't we? We're at, and then on October the 16th, we'll do the demonstrators. So we're adding October the 16th. October the 9th on Turn Me Loose, October the 16th on the demonstrators. All right. Today we are honored to have Frank X. Walker as our guest, known as Professor X to his students. Mr. Walker is a native of Danville, Kentucky, and the first African-American writer to be named Kentucky Poet Laureate. He has published 10 collections of poetry, including the book we are reading, Turn Me Loose, The Unghosting of Medgar Evers, which was awarded the 2014 NAACP Image Award for Poetry and the Black Caucus American Library Association Honor Award for Poetry. He is also the author of Buffalo Dance, The Journey of York, winner of the 2004 Lillian Smith Book Award, and Isaac Murphy, I Dedicate This Ride, which he adapted for stage, earning him the Paul Green Foundation Playwrights Fellowship Award. His poetry was also dramatized for the 2016 Contemporary American Theater Festival in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, and was staged by the Message Theater for the 2015 Breeders' Cup Festival. Voted one of the most creative professors in the South, Professor X coined the term Afrolacha, co-founded the Afrolachian Poets Group, and in 2020 published a book, pardon me, it's 2002, published a book titled Afrolacha Poems. I got the date wrong again, 2000. In 2000. All right. Bibliographers, please be forgiving of me. He received the 2004 Lannan Literary Fellowship for Poetry, the 2008 and 2009 Denny C. Plattner Award for Outstanding Poetry and Appalachian Heritage, and the 2013 West Virginia Humanities Council's Appalachian Heritage Award. The recipient of honorary doctorates from the University of Kentucky, Transylvania University, Spalding University, and Centre College, Professor X is the founding editor of Pluck, the Journal of Appalachian Arts and Culture, and serves as professor of English and African American and Africana Studies at the University of Kentucky in Lexington. Please welcome Frank X. Walker to the Welty at Home Book Club.
Everyone.
Thanks. I have the privilege of asking the first question in this session, so I'll launch our question and answer session now. Your primary subject has been Appalachia, but when you wrote The Unghosting of Medgar Evers, we are very grateful that you did. You departed from your native region. This book is powerful. It's much needed. Can you tell us what prompted you to choose this topic outside your home region and how you went about researching it and how long it took you to write it?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. And I think I'll push back a little bit because I don't feel like it's outside my region. You know, I think a lot of people don't think of Kentucky as the South because we're just more north of some other places in the South. But if you live here and you know our history, you recognize how inseparable we are to everything that is traditionally Southern. My initial motivation was my students' lack of information about Medgar. I had asked them invited them to a conversation about the significant assassinations from the Civil Rights era. And there were almost 200 kids in the class. It was a large Medgar class. And none of them mentioned Medgar Evers. They all mentioned the big three. And I was struck by that, you know, in fact, quite disturbed that there's a whole generation of young people who might actually matriculate with multiple degrees and not ever hear the name or know the history and legacy of somebody as important as Medgar Evers. And that led me to a poem by Lucille Clifton, which was a comment on the fact that Byron de la Beckwith lived to be an old man, and Medgar never, ever, ever would. And I carried that poem around with me for weeks. It troubled me to a degree that I was just drawn to, I guess, reopen what I understood about Medgar's legacy and history and knowledge, and that kind of deep dive into movies and books and other poems and music led me to where I go when I need therapy, to the page. And I just started writing these poems. And I don't think I initially set out to write a book or a collection. I was just trying to make it make sense for me. And I'm glad it led to, you know, it's become a very useful project to a lot of people. If that makes sense at all.
Yes, thank you. I love it that Lucille Clifton played a role as well as your student, and that your students did, sending you to this topic. Our next question is from Susan Ford.
Hi, I really have to say before my question, I love this collection. It's just amazing.
Thank you, Susan.
Last week we were talking about the sonnet that opens the collection, and we mentioned, although we didn't have any rationale for it, your use of tercets, and you've got these two parallel voice poems that I don't know if there's a term for. We also have a fairy tale or a ghost tale with that Harriet Tubman poem. And there's another poem where you're writing in legal language, and another sonnet in part 5, and a recipe. So, and then at the end, you talk about bruised couplets in the final poem. So we were real curious, I think, about can you talk a little bit about your use of poetic forms and whether that idea of the bruised couplets kind of works in somehow to the way you're thinking about form in this collection?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's something that comes up quite often when I think about historical poetry and the way that I present it. It tends to draw two different audiences: people who come from a literary direction, who are looking for the poetry and looking specifically and intentionally at just the poetry, and then people who come for the historical information, who don't really care about form and content and tercets and distracting uh, stanzas. For them, they just want to know, where the information came from and is it true, and can it be challenged. That's the kind of historical um, nuisance is what I refer to quite often, because um, for me, it makes me feel like I have two masters that I'm trying to serve, because I know that if I focus on the history, no matter how accurate it is, that a fan of poetry will not even care about that. They will ask about, you know, the the sonnet that had one too many lines, or the meter that was off, or their challenges will be specifically in their area of interest. So for me, I've been trying to find this balance to serve both audiences in a way that satisfies both groups, but also invites them to the other space that they're not that comfortable in, but not intimidated by. I spent a lot of time with form in this collection, on purpose. I had a chance to watch the recording from the last conversation you guys had, and I appreciated the detail to the poetry that you spent, and it really felt like I was listening to a literature class, not a history class. And I think it's nice when it shifts back and forth and you get both participants in the same conversation. But form is important to me, as is the historical information. And for me, I can't even start the poems until I've done enough research to feel like I could give a couple of lectures about the topic, down to specific dates and places and names. Because one of the things I learned about writing the Lewis and Clark books is that, the landscape is often a main character. And even though it's human voices in most cases, sometimes you have to personify things to give them a human voice, to bring them into the conversation, to flesh out the story. So I'll cut myself off there. Make room for other questions.
I'll supplement Susan's question. Could you talk specific? There are a number of haikus here. Why have you chosen the haiku as a form that you think is appropriate here?
Well, again, I'm thinking about a range of readers, and I want people who have the most kind of minute sense of what poetry is, recognize that, oh, that's a form that I'm familiar with. Because I've written a haiku and I've read one, but they may not recognize a sonnet on the page, or recognize that there are different kinds of sonnets, or know that they're looking at a tercet versus a couplet. If it's not important to them, I'm okay with that, but I don't want them to be distracted by it, so the content is also equally important. And, there are more modern forms like the contrapuntal. The ambivalence over the Confederate flag is a contrapuntal, and people look at that and see the two columns and may not initially recognize that there are three poems on the page, and those two opposite columns are contrasting points of view, but can all be read together as one voice, to kind of get a sense of what it sounds like to compromise, to tell the whole story in the same space, in the same breath. And I think that's part of what I was doing or trying to do with the architecture of the book. When I think about Strange Fruit and Dixie, and how those two songs are oppositional voices with each other, in the same way that the widow versus the wife, Myrlie Evers is the foil to, De La Beckwith when he speaks. That much hatred can only be softened with the kind of kindness and compassion that Myrlie offers on the page. And I wanted that to move people through the book, in a way that didn't force you to drop the book and put it down, that, you know, you were able to consume all this discomfort and negative emotional energy that you have to carry to read these poems, you know, really, really closely. They bother you, they disturb you, but you also need voices to kind of soothe you and comfort you, to offer you hope. So that was my challenge, you know, how do I find the balance? How do I, you know, what poem should follow the next poem, and what two voices are in opposition, but also offer a full conversation so that a reader can get a sense of, you know, how do you move through these difficult conversations? I mean, the topic in general is still the most difficult conversation in America today. You know, how do you do that in a collection of poetry and not let it feel like it's just structural stuff, you know, on the page, or just a history lesson? You know, how is it more human? You know, how do you pull people in emotionally? And I think, you know, that forces a lot of attention on the word choices and how they present on the page, and where the spaces are and where the line breaks. All those things are very intentional, down to the titles and the epigraphs. I mean, I know a lot of people won't read the introduction, or they won't read the timeline, but I hope that people read from cover to cover, because everything is there for the reader to kind of add to what I hope the experience might be for you if you can survive the book.
We have done that. We are very grateful for everything from the epigraph to the timeline. And let me say, I think the marrying of form and content is brilliant here, and it makes everything so much more powerful. Let me move to Beverly for a question. Is Beverly here?
Don't see a Beverly.
I don't see a Beverly. Would you like to save Beverly's question and see if she
Yeah,
comes?
I'll save that. Now, let me move to Harriet. Pollock has a question.
Hello. Let me begin by again thanking you for this collection. I'm grateful for it. I was hoping to get you to talk some about the choices you made when deciding who would voice the poems in the collection. We hear Medgar Evers' voice in the collection title and epigraph, but not in the poems. And in addition to Merle Evers and Byron de la Beckwith, who we might expect, we hear Beckwith's two wives, Willie and Thelma, and Medgar's brother, Charles, as well as the chorus. I wanted to ask if you could share some thoughts about the choices you made. Why not Medgar? Why the particular others, especially the delay wives? I hear you beginning to answer that question when you're talking about the contrapuntal, I think, and having two different points of view that actually turn out to be, or two poems that turn out to be three, in the sense of something going on between them. I also couldn't help thinking across to Gwendolyn Brooks' Emmett Till poems, where she has Mississippi Mother burning bacon, Carolyn Bryant versus the Bronzeville Mother mourning her child. And I wondered if the Brooks poems had anything to do with your choices.
Well, I'll answer the easy ones first. I'm a huge fan of Gwendolyn Brooks and her work. I wouldn't say those poems, particularly those poems, influenced the choices I made. You know, I was trying to do something very intentional with the choices. First, the most noticeable one, obviously, is the absence of Medgar's voice. And I felt like that you could Google Medgar Evers and get 5 examples of him talking. But you would struggle trying to find even a quote from the wives, you know, Thelma or Willie.
Yeah.
And, you know, there aren't very many cases where you could find it, but you could hear the actual words unfiltered from de la Beckwith. And I thought about the fact that, you know, for me, on a personal level, I didn't know if I could write in Becker's voice. You know, it was easier to write the Lewis and Clark books when they first came out were in the voice of African-American male York, which is not a lot of distance for me to travel. You know, that's just in the mirror. Beckwith was very different because doing the research, you know, I was immediately uncomfortable. Every step I took, everything I read, just got underneath my skin. But I also recognized that if I could not just feel that, but if I could articulate what that felt like enough to recreate that on the page for other readers, then I may have accomplished something that's kind of rare in poetry to really get people to have enough empathy to forget the poet and believe the voice that they just heard from and read, and that was the goal. I needed Myrlie Evers' voice to be there primarily because De La Beckwith was so strong. You know, I didn't want it to be a book that he drove the entire way. You know, well, I found out very early in the process, I just had a stack of poems. I didn't have a book yet. And I was at a conference of librarians somewhere in Virginia. And I read for 20 minutes straight, all poems in De La Beckwith's voice. And I wasn't that familiar with the work yet, so I didn't even look up until the very end. And I raised my head, and the entire room was in tears. I mean, people were absolutely wiped out. And I was a little stunned by that because I hadn't thought about how it might affect people hearing them together. But it taught me two things. You know, one, the work and his voice was powerful enough to be believed, enough to move people emotionally. And two, that together in one piece was too much.
Mhm.
So I made a conscious decision when I was trying to put the book in the right order to not give him too much energy and to find ways to create a balance and to use that kind of idea of, you know, Dixie and Strange Fruit, you know, moving back and forth and creating these binaries and parallels all the way through the book so that it felt like a conversation. And it felt like, you know, my mother had this idea that there were two sides to every story, and then there was a truth. And that the truth was the combined point of view of everybody present. And even with a coin, you know, there's the back and the front, but there's also the edge of the coin. People forget about a coin having a third side. In the same way they think that the truth is either, you know, my story or your story. But my mother always taught me that the truth was the combination of our stories. And so that's what I was reaching for. So I needed those even contrary points of view to be present, to be speaking about this man's legacy. I mean, you already know how the story ends. I mean, there's no surprise in the story at all, but I needed something to be surprising to make you want to turn the page. And it had more to do with, you know, being surprised at who was speaking and how the voices worked in cooperation or lack of cooperation with each other about the same topics.
Could you come back to the question of why not Medgar Evers? Why?
Well, it would have been, to me, it felt cliche. You already heard, you can hear, most people have heard, if you know who he is, you probably heard his voice. I mean, you can Google, but Google Thelma de la Beckwith's voice. I don't think you would get anything.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
that allows me to, you know, these poems for me come out of, you know, memory, research, imagination, and empathy. If I have too much information to start with, then I don't have to use my imagination. And for me, the more imagination I have a chance to use, the more opportunity there is to create poetry versus another historical document. Now, I'm not trying to write just history. I'm trying to write poetry informed by history. To me, that's what historical poetry is.
Thanks.
Jessica, I think you had a question along these lines. Do you want to raise that now about the relationship between history and poetry? Jessica?
Oh, me.
Yeah. You don't have to. We can come back to it later.
Yeah. Why? I feel selfish. I want to make sure that all our other guests have time as well. But actually, no, all right, I'm going to just be selfish and ask a question. This was so powerful to me just because as a Jacksonian, I have a lot of books about Medgar Evers. I've read a lot of books. I've read Bobby DeLauder's book, and we have 2 biographies of Medgar Evers in our home. So he's as a historical figure represented in thick volumes in my life. And while I've gained a lot from them, this small volume that you made was so powerful. And there was something about the form, using the poetry form in the context of history. I don't know, it really moved me in a different way. And I don't really know. This really isn't forming as a question, but maybe more of a comment, that it was just very emotionally effective. And I guess my question is, how did you create such a powerful, like, where do you think the power comes from in this form? Because it's not coming from its length, it's coming from somewhere else.
I do hear several questions in there, and thank you for all of them. I think for me, it's important to appreciate that each of the poems have an emotional temperature, and that's on purpose, because what I'm trying to do that I don't think history is allowed to do is to make sure the reader feels something. So the only thing I have access to I can't force you or make you really, but I can invite you to feel if I can tap into your own humanity. So there are poems about loss. Nobody owns love or hate or discomfort. And then a lot of it, is just to tap into your own, what you have access to versus force feeding you. Like, there are a lot of things about sex in these poems, but I pull way back. I think I pull way back, and just kind of take you to the edge of it. And hopefully, if you have access to the information because of your own personal history, you can go the rest of the way yourself. There are a lot of, I heard a wonderful explication of one of the poems from the last recording where, there was the conversation about, at least the poetic literary conversation about metaphorical death being the same as an orgasm. I mean, you didn't go that far in the conversation, but most people miss that. But it's there, and it's there on purpose, but it's only there for people who have access to it. So to me, it was one of the ways to make sure that the discomfort that you experience is because of the intersections of race and class and sex and violence. And when they collide, things happen that make you feel something, even if it's just discomfort. One of the reasons there are so many dreams in this collection is that, for me, it's a way to have the psychological state of the individual introduced into the conversation. We are, it's like we are what we eat, but what we dream is also a byproduct of what we consume and what we're thinking about. But more than anything, our dreams and nightmares reveal the things we obsess about. So I think you can learn more if I suggest something that a character dreamt than if I told you about that character, or that character spoke and said something. So I'm trying to hit all the angles and all the channels in that little bit of space, because I need you to feel your way through this book. And ideally, at the end, just be emotionally exhausted, and understand that, what you just experienced was something that this little thing gave you. And that in other cases, I always use this for my students, that the Titanic, the movie, is almost 3 hours long. But I can save you 3 hours in 2 words: ship sank. Love story, That's what poetry does. It takes this huge thing and tries to artistically compress it into the smallest parts possible without taking the flavor out of it. The flavor is just distilled into these small bites, but you can still taste the larger parts of it and still recognize that people come to poetry because they don't have time to read the novel and they need, microwave this story for me real quick, love story. Got it. Go about my business. So I think that's why people come to poetry. And I think that's why my poems are only as long as they are, because I'm thinking that, if you've got the whole week, you're going to read a novel. You're not going to read. But if you want to know about this story, this particular part of history, then, this is book. You can read this in one sitting, people who don't, either they want to savor it. They want to, just kind of sleep with some of the poems and think about what they experience. But a lot of people just read it straight through and then read it again, because if you will miss something if you read it straight through. There's so much there that's there for only people who have the opportunity to connect to it because of their own personal experience. And so I think it affirms your humanity and it affirms your own personal experience. So you feel like this book, you have a connection with it. And I think that's my goal. I hope that happens for every person, but in different poems, usually. There's just a familiarity that happens because of the emotional content and how it's placed and paced, and that you feel something. And it's like, it's like riding in the country and you hit that one road that suddenly dives down and kind of takes your breath away. I hope some of these poems did that for you. They just kind of hit you in the gut and you felt something, even if it was just discomfort. Then I did my job.
You did your job. I'm sure we've all felt that. The compression, the intensity, experiencing the hatred and the love that you're talking about. And we do experience them. We don't just read about them, but we participate in them. Let me call on an old friend of yours. Minrose Gwynn has a question for you.
Hey, Minrose. And Paula, I see you too.
You're muted, Minrose.
You're still muted, Minrose.
Can you unmute for us?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Thanks.
I didn't realize I was muted. Hello.
Hey.
It's great to see you again. In one of our email exchanges before you published the book, before the book came out, and we were talking about it on email, you said to me that you want readers of the volume to, I'm quoting, interrogate the relationship between between ignorance, fear, hatred, racism, and violence. And certainly these poems do that, force us to do that. But in this context, my question is, what does it mean to unghost Medgar Evers, to turn him loose?
Yeah, I'm going to treat those separately. I think, because I think they almost contradict each other. Because I think collectively we've turned him loose. We've let him go in any space where he's been forgotten. Myrle's commitment is to his legacy. I mean, she spent her whole adult life making sure people did not forget this man and what he gave and what it cost their entire family. I mean, that's her legacy. Even to this day, when she speaks, you hear that in her voice and her daughter's voice. And for me, the unghosting means of don't let him remain a ghost. Let him be real in your life. Know his story enough to repeat it, to make sure it's told. to make sure it's not forgotten. And I still leave the turn me loose, the physical part, that just seemed like the perfect, the fact that that's what he said when he sat up on the gurney in the hospital. His last words before he died was turn me loose. To have that, we know how the story ends, but to have his actual final words in the title of the book just gets it out of the way, So the whole book is not about death. It's about everything, not just leading up to it, but this kind of this larger story that, this cauldron that is the South, that is about these binary, these oppositional forces that live and dwell in the same space, that look at the same things, but experience it differently. I think of a poem like One Mississippi, Two Mississippis, that evokes class and race in a way to where at some point it blurs before the poem is over. And you're not sure if we're talking about a thing that happens because of race or a thing that happens because of class, and how it's not just that simple. It's not, I think the conversation, last week or the last conversation talked about, this idea that racism is limited to poor white males in the South, which we know is not the case. That it's really bigger than that. That kind of shrunken, abbreviated, stereotype of, if you really look at this book and dissect it in the way that you guys are doing, it has so many ramifications for what's happening today. It's I continue to be surprised at how timeless some of the topics are that come out of the poems, because we're talking about the same things even today. We could have had this conversation 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, unfortunately. But the beauty of it is that you can use it to talk about historical details and facts in a way that hopefully people aren't as intimidated by it. If you invited people, students, if you say, read, the first 500 pages of the civil rights, era, and we'll talk about it on Monday, they're going to shut down. But you hand them this, very thin book and say, read this by next week. We're going to talk about it. You can still have the same conversation, and they can still be informed at a level that they weren't, they were ignorant about it in a lot of cases, if they were my students. That really invites them in, and lets it not be this historical, thing, but about their own life, because it's so familiar. The timeline, comes forward and allows them to recognize that, Trayvon Martin somehow is connected to Emmett Till, somehow connected to this story. I know Trayvon Martin. I know what happened. I was alive. It was on my phone. I read about it. I saw the video. But they had probably not connected that to Medgar Evers, and the past. So I'm hoping that those kind of details, really allow it to be a good conversation book. I think whoever made this choice, thank you. And maybe you can encourage other people to use it in classrooms. The link that Jessica shared earlier in the chat is a thing that lives on, it's 10 years old at this point, but it lives on PRX, formerly NPR in Kentucky. But it's actually this, me reading poems, but for an hour, accompanied by music from the same time period. I love, Dr. Mars, Suzanne's, conversation about remembering music from the era and how it set the tone, at least for Merrily in the Bedroom. But if you look at songs and music from the same era that the poems are set in, you get even a larger story, because you hear the music that De La Becca was listening to, and that Wilma was listening to, and the general public was listening to. It really tells a different story and adds a layer of texture to the whole narrative that just really makes it more powerful. So if I could give a homework assignment before we have the next conversation, listen to that radio piece in your car or in your home, and it really adds to the power of the whole narrative. Just having that musical soundtrack really enriches the experience.
Wonderful. We'll now assign, that's now part of your assignment, everybody. We'll do. I have a whole list of questions, but I'd like to open it up. If anyone has a question, if you'll raise your hand, we'll take them from the group. My next question was going to be, could you talk about the way the poem investigates the links between sexism and racism? And Beckwith's attitude towards his wives, towards African-American women, and towards race as intersecting.
Yeah. Well, for me, I was trying to, I really didn't want Beckwith to be a cardboard cartoon character. I mean, I really wanted to, try to imagine him, at least his point of view, where humor was concerned, his point of view where love was concerned, his point of view. But I also wanted to be clear that he fits the profile for like a textbook psychopath, sociopath. I mean, he's in that space, which means that if you study those cases, it's not a surprise to find out that he's sexist, he's abusive, that his hatred doesn't have boundaries, that he only loves his own reflection and other people who fit his reflection. So I mean, he's more he's kind of a textbook case for why white supremacy makes sense to him. I mean, he really believes that he is the creme de la creme, and anything that's not white and male and him is less than that. And it shows up in everything he does, how he treats his wives, how he treats people of color, how he feels about people of color, the things he said in the speeches with the Klan, those people ask me if I have favorite poems in this collection. They're all the dream poems, because I got to take huge leaps with my own imagination, because I'm trying to characterize and capture his psychological state. And I think they do it better than any other poem in the collection. But that's the short version of me trying to.
Joubert?
Just very briefly, I want to say I enjoyed your metaphor about the two sides of the coin, and then you mentioned the edge of the coin. I have a coin at home, a British pound, that commemorates the end of slavery, the slave trade in England in 1837. And I noticed some writing on the edge of the coin. I got my magnifying glass, and around the coin is inscribed, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Wow. So there is something on the edge of the coin sometimes. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm going to try to find a copy of that coin now.
Right, Harriet?
So I was going to invite you to give us the longer version of your answer about the dream poems. I have to say, I imagined how uncomfortable it must have been to write Byron to the Beckwith, and then there are these incredible poems that go into his subconscious, and I wondered if you'd say something more about the series of dream poems.
Well, I mean, I can't offer more than I feel like I've already said, other than how important I felt they were to seeing him as a whole person and not a cardboard two-dimensional character. And the women who, I think in Merle, when Merle talks about dreams, she's visioning kind of a better South and a better America. The dreams for, the antagonists in the book are really about where they were in that moment. And, it's just to kind of, illustrate their state of mind and almost explain their behavior.
Mm.
You have a kind of double edge, don't you? Dream as an aspiration and dream as the subconscious, and there's the tension.
And Southern Dreams, your section, yeah.
Cheryl.
Excuse me. Hello, Dr. Walker. I finished sorry, one second. So I finished the last section just before before our meeting today, and it was incredibly emotional, reflecting on the whole book. And you did a phenomenal job with like kind of a roller coaster of emotion and reflection is what I experienced. And I did feel just almost too exhausted from the thought process in a good way that I didn't want to come, but I did. So I wanted to commend you on some of the titles and your word choices and like the structure. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippis, we've already talked about. White of Way, the unwritten rules, how long that chapter title or poem title is, and World War II. I really liked when you reflected on that Charles and Medgar Evers had both been in war. They were vets. That's why he's buried in Arlington. And then you mentioned you wanted to encourage readers to engage in a full conversation and look at the perceptions of others. And I was thinking about your Harriet Tubman as villain poem and that perception. I was thinking about Willie de la Beckwith's perceptions in Epiphany, and thinking of the white farm family freezing to death because they now have to farm their own land themselves, and 1/3 of 180 grams of lead for you to put us in the heads of the actual bullet as symbol. And that concludes my comments.
Okay. Well, thank you for all of those. Yeah, I mean, that's, I talk about this. This is the only book of, I think my bio is a little outdated because I have 13 collections now. But this is the only one where I actually consciously talk about the architecture of the book, how important it was to everything about the book. I mean, I put more work into the structure and arrangement than any book I've written. But I don't know that I could have done it differently. It had to be done in order for the book to succeed. And it even had the potential to be used as, if I dare say, like a blueprint for reconciliation. I mean, but in as much as you have to experience or re-experience the trauma to have an opportunity to talk about it. And if you can't talk about it, you can never heal from it. So you got to go backwards. But it can't just be a book about trauma, There are dozens of those already out there. How can you do this in a different way that invites people in? And in this way, in the same way that I hadn't imagined, have larger conversations about it. Like this book is like a doorway to the conversation you have because you read the book. Then the book is doing its job.
Yeah, I want us to talk next time about the architecture of the book, which I think is so impressive, and the 5 sections that you've divided it into. And I did want to ask, just the final section is called Rotten Fruit, not Strange Fruit, but Rotten Fruit. Is that are you setting that up as an oxymoron about the horrible price that has been paid for what progress has been made or what hope does exist?
I'm going to say all of that. I think, it's all complicated. It's never simple, and, as much as you love fruit, what do you do when you get to the rotten part? Right? I mean, some people throw the whole piece of fruit away. Some people cut it off and enjoy what's left. I think I think those are the kind of choices we have as we move through, whatever our future is going to be. You don't. I know people who are afraid to go or come to the South because everything they believe about the South. And that thing that's rotten for them are all the traumatic horror stories they've heard, but never personally experienced, but it's given the South such a black eye that it becomes like the rot on the fruit. But if you live in the South and visit the South, you know that there's so much fruit that you're it's like throwing a baby out with the bathwater. You don't, because there's so much good still there, and I think that it's inseparable. So that for me, that the rotten fruit metaphor is does two things. It plays with poets love to play with words and spaces and how they relate with each other. So it's automatically an easy reach back to strange fruit. But then there's a poem about Dela Beckwith as a child. I think that might be the rotten fruit poem. But a child is innocent, right? But also we all know kids who were rotten when they were kids. It's like that one little bully or that one kid that sets cats on fire, or we all know one of those kids. And so something has already happened to that kid, may not have been born, but it may have already been traumatized so early in their life that the rotten has been, the thing that's been fed, like Darth Vader, not the good. So that's the thing that becomes the personification of that individual. And if it's fed in the same way that, if you murder somebody and come home to your hometown, they throw you a victory parade, how are you supposed to feel? I mean, you feel like a hero, right? I mean, you did something that your hometown has embraced and now has your name up in banners and welcomes you home, and you just killed a man. How do you not think you did something good, at least in somebody's opinion, that you wanted to respect and appreciate you? So I can see why he bragged about it for all his adult years, because he was part of a community that celebrated him for his action. He did something that they maybe privately wished they'd have done or wished had happened. So he was their hero. So I think, he's an easy villain, and I think and there's nothing funny in this book, but I worked very hard to try to insert humor, conversations about humor in the book, because I understand how, sometimes when we're most uncomfortable that we laugh, and it's not because we think it's funny, it's because it's kind of an escapism for the moment, to kind of chuckle about a thing or to make light of a difficult situation, but it's kind of a survival strategy. So all those things are happening, and hopefully, you recognize that there's a lot of intentionality in the placement on the page, on the lines, in the stanzas, on the pages, and the sections. And, I didn't do that overnight. It was like, okay, this is not working. How can I make it move in this way? That took almost as long as writing the poems in the first place. And to the point, I'll just add this one last thing, that University of Georgia published the book, but they weren't the original press. The original press, who I won't name, contacted me after the book had gone through every stage, even the cover design, everything was there, except, maybe the back, the blurbs on the back. And the publisher said they could not publish the book unless I took out, I think, 7 or 8 poems because of their allusions to sex or violence, that they didn't think they belonged in the book, and they didn't want to subject their readers and readers in general to that kind of horror. And I said, I can't take those. I'll be willing to look at them again and maybe rewrite them. But for me, it would be like taking a leg off of a racehorse. each one of those legs were that important to shaping the whole story and building these real characters for me. And they said, if you don't take them out, we will not publish your book. And I said, okay, send it back to me. How do I get out of the contract? And they sent me a form and I signed it, express mailed it back, and we were done. And I was already working on the next book project, and I got an email from poetry editor at University of Georgia Press. And apparently this story was moving around in the poetry circles. And she said, I heard this rumor that you had a book that had been rejected. Could I see some of the poems? I sent the whole manuscript. She sent me back a contract the next day. So try to imagine what you just read minus 8 poems. I mean, which 8 poems could you lose? And
good for you and good for Georgia.
Yes, kudos to us both for that. But it was, it being a whole was more important than me getting published. And I worked too hard to build that thing, and it was all in my head. It had to be like that. And maybe that night it felt stupid, and I was like lashing myself, saying, you missed the opportunity. But in service of the book and the narrative, it had to be the way it's, what you read is what I want you to read.
Minrose.
I just had a follow-up question on this idea of unghosting Medgar Evers. Your book came out, I believe, 2013, right?
That's
and
right.
Yeah, and there was a kind of a shower of books around that time on Medgar Evers. Also, Merle Evers has been going around the country for decades trying to raise the memory of her husband to a larger audience. In fact, she was so upset when she went to a college at one point, and she asked someone, one of the students walking down the street, do you know who Medgar Evers was? And he thought that Medgar Evers was a basketball player. And so I guess my question is, do you think that with the shower of books and Merle Evers' efforts and other people's efforts in the classroom and outside the classroom, do you think that the cultural memory of Medgar Evers and what he stood for has become more widespread in this 10-year period since your book was published?
I would say yes, if you consider our books, because yours did an even better job, folded all the efforts in multiple art forms about what was happening to keep that legacy alive. But I would say that there's so much more. I think as conversation starters, yes, but I think there's only so much a book can do. And I'm saying this as a writer. I remember that, that horrible thing people used to say about if you want to hide something from people, put it in a book. And there are a lot of communities where that's still true. That in the same way that the movie version is preferred by my students, they always ask me, is there a film? Can I just watch the movie instead of reading the book? I'm like, there's no film for this book. You just read the book. But they would rather, spend 2 hours watching the film than, however long it takes to read 20 pages. But to their, to their credit, they recognize what happens in a movie versus what happens on the page, and which is my challenge. In a movie, you get a dozen different artists all combining to advance the narrative. You get, you got the costume maker, the light person, the writer, the musician, the soundtrack. I mean, everybody is all trying to advance this narrative in this most powerful way possible. when it's me and the book and the page, it's just, that's it. That's all I have. But I want you to hear a soundtrack. You know, I want you to understand that something's happening with lighting. I want you to see what people look like. You know, I want those imagistic things that happen in a cinematic way on the big screen to like find their way to my pages. And it happens if you feel an emotional thing, you also, I mean, that feeling connects you to some other things that are also visual, and have sound connected to them. Like all those things in the service of the narrative, you know, I think that's the height of poetry, is to figure out how to do that. And I'm still trying to master that, you know. I'm still a toddler when it comes to poetry. If you don't read the book and feel like you've watched a film. So maybe that's my novel, but you know, I still have work to do. But all of that, you know, Rose, I think the books can only do so much. You know, that's one of the reasons I wanted to connect you guys to the link that has the poems and this amazing soundtrack, you know, to the same era that raises up the story even higher than I could have done it if I just read to you for the last hour. It's better than what I could have done if I just read to you, because now you have the music, you have a narrative in between by a couple of PhDs talking about history, filling in the gaps. So the tone is set. And I guarantee that, you know, when you hear this thing on your radio, that it'll fill up your space in a way that you didn't think the book had done yet or could do, and will recognize which one is better. Of course, the book is always better, but in this case, it is the book with a soundtrack, and it's free. So I'm not selling anything, but you will enjoy it.
We will enjoy it. Can I ask one quick question? I meant to ask this earlier, but that is, were you aware of Eudora Welty's story, Where Is the Voice Coming From, when you composed the poem?
Yes. You know, I'm an English major, recovering English major. So you don't get a degree without having read Welty, and being part of the South. It's kind of a given. But there were things I did not know about until I read Memrose's book, that really broadened the story. And I'm so glad that book exists. You know, I think that somewhere there's a classroom that has both of those books for those students every semester, and that's where I want my kids to be. But yeah, you know, I appreciate the fact that this writing group exists, and that, you know, you're doing this kind of work, because it really broadens the importance of writers in general. I mean, I think about, you know, the beautiful thing about Jackson is the writers community and how it works going backwards in time and forward. I have a lot of friends who teach at Jackson State, and friends I've met over the years because of this work that have now become part of my larger writers community. And and clearly, you know, Welty was part of one.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to Jessica.
All right, well, I'm just here to say we are officially out of time. Suzanne, I'll give you the very last word, but I just wanted to say to everyone who participated today, thank you for sending in your comments, and thank you, Professor X, for letting us be your students today. We appreciate your presence and your insights so much. All of y'all in the book club, we announced some changes at the beginning of today's session. I'll mention them real quickly. We're going to continue our discussion of Turn Me Loose, because we only got to discuss the first half of the book. We're going to continue that on this October 9th. We're going to move our discussion of Welty's The Demonstrators to October 16th, who were previously off, will be on, and October 23rd will be our final session. And in your upcoming Welty at Home, we'll have the link for that Frank shared with us that he just mentioned with the soundtrack. Suzanne, any last comments as we close?
I just want to say to Frank X, thank you for this wonderful and enduring gift you have given us today. It was a wonderful privilege to have you spend this hour with us, and it's a great privilege to read and to reread these magnificent poems. Thank you.